Today on Rebuilders, we are back after quite a long break and we're asking the question, are we moving from a post-Christian culture to a post-secular culture?
Change, not more change. I'm sick of it. Yes, we're talking today whether, post-Christianity, which is something we've talked a lot about. A lot of people have gotten used to the idea of moving from a Christendom society, a post-Christian society. What if we're moving again to something post-secular, something more irrational, open to the spiritual? And also, is this partially what's behind some of what has been called the quiet revival? Is it also really a spiritual opening at the same time?
It's a great episode. We look forward to sharing it with you. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. Welcome back.
Good to be back.
We're back.
Yes.
Yeah. How long's it been, Daniel?
It's been 84 days, which equals 12 weeks.
Wowee.
Yeah.
Have you just been sitting in that chair counting the entire time?
Just waiting, pining for you guys to come back.
Well, jokes aside, it is so good to have you out of prison and back with us, Daniel.
After that
Short stint for pastry illegal pastry operation. You're running out the back of your car. It was a short stint in prison. I hope you've learned your lesson. And I was moved by your apology video.
It was beautiful.
It was, yeah.
Currently on 5 views.
Nothing like a good bootleg croissant though. In other news, while we've been offline, you actually drew our attention to this, Liddy, but I just want to acknowledge it and just celebrate it. A man by the name of Leslie Lemon celebrated his 106th birthday back in June, and he, when speaking about his long life, he says, "The secret to my long life is custard." Custard, custard, custard.
You've waited for this for 84 days.
Oh, I love 84 it. Days. I want to meet this man, and I aspire to be like him.
Wasn't there also, you sent us something, I can't even remember who it was. There was someone who publicly announced that they were a non-hair washer like you.
Oh, yeah. What's his name? Brandon Lake?
Yeah.
Yeah. 15 years since he last washed his hair. So look, guys, I'm not just making stuff up over here. I'm speaking hard truths.
I think you need to hear some hard truths.
I haven't got 15 years, but it'll get there.
Yeah.
Oh, it's nice to talk about custard again.
Yeah.
What sort of custard do you put in your illegal pastries? Street pastries.
I am unable to talk about such things.
Yes, for fear of allegedly. Yeah. By the way, we're joking.
Yeah.
I just realised Australian sarcasm can move fast quickly.
Start getting emails in.
Yeah, for all hands. Daniel did not go to jail for illegal pastry.
No.
We just had a bit of a break.
Yes.
Which lots happening. Mm-hmm. We're always running the church, and I was overseas too.
Yeah, so you've come back from Europe a little while ago. You've had a bit of time to probably take stock of that trip now.
Yeah.
What have you kind of taken away from it? I know we're going to be getting into a lot of it today, but
it was good. I was in England and the Republic of Ireland and Germany and Czech Republic and Norway and Denmark, and met also lots of people from all over, European leaders at different events I was at. So it was great, and it was actually good to sort of get on the when this trip was sort of planned. The sort of what's been called the quiet revival, and that wasn't really. It was starting to rumble away. But it was just good to get on the ground in a lot of these countries where stuff's happening and just hear from people how they're experiencing it. And excited to sort of, I guess I've had some time to reflect on that.
Yes.
Which is really what we're going to look at today.
Yeah, great. Well, shall we dive in?
Yeah.
Great. First question I want to ask you is there something surprising happening among the young?
Yeah. Well, we won't go through too many of the stats. We've shared some of them before. I might share a few extra ones. But, I think many people know, have heard about, what in England's been called, or England, Wales being called I'm not sure if it has the same stats in Scott, but let's just say Britain, that, church attendance amongst 18 to 24-year-olds has quadrupled between 2018 and 2024 from 4% to 16%, and particularly amongst young men, which now 21% are attending monthly. But it was just interesting also to get out of the English-speaking world, and, interesting Finland, again, very secular country. In the last sort of couple of years, or I think the last handful of years, sort of belief in God has sort of doubled amongst Gen Z for boys and girls. And, things like belief in the literal resurrection of Jesus has doubled. In France, baptism sort of gone up 30% in 1 year, and teen baptisms nearly doubled. So again, something happening with the young. In Sweden, Jesus was named, there's like a youth barometer, which looks at just trends in Swedish culture. And, they named in 2025, Jesus the influencer of the year.
That's wild.
The Netherlands, religious affiliation, instead of declining, which it has for decades, went up. Not a huge amount, 42 to 44%, but reversing the decline. In Norway, we just spent quite a bit of time in Norway. Some significant sort of like growth happening in the church. Possibly, I haven't got all the stats. And some of these are not in English, but possibly I would say something even more than what's happening in the UK is happening in Norway. Belgium, young people identify as Christian increased 29% over the previous generation. I was in Denmark. I preached on a Sunday in Denmark, and I think it was Politik in the sort of main newspaper there in their Sunday mag. The front cover was, all about the sort of return of Christianity. So having been in Europe before and spoken in some of these places before and visited these places, quite a surprising outcome. But I think, part of the question and even the framing of the term, the quiet revival, for me, as I listened to people, I began to sort of wonder whether that's the most apt. Nothing against the people who come up with the quiet revival, Bible Society, I think it's a good term. But, looking across what's happening in Europe, it was really, really interesting because classically, as we've understood revivals, awakenings, whatever you want to call them, often it's like, the Spirit comes upon the church is then sort of empowered and it becomes magnetic and people come and evangelism increases. And there's some of that happening. So some of the stories, the good news stories you'll hear, will be from like churches in the UK where that's happening. But I think what I found really interesting is churches where people are turning up to their surprise. And the church is not doing anything spectacular. There's not been a revival amongst the people in that particular church. There's just people turning up. And, I began to sort of realize that, what we've never really seen or not seen for some time is a lot of the stories we tell about renewal and awakening, particularly in the West, were awakenings where, in a sense, the church was, in a quite still culturally Christian culture. Yeah. And that it then sort of became alive, hence the set term awake, or renewed or revived. But we're in a moment now where in many of these countries are deeply secular or quite, on the path to secularization. And there seems to be something bigger happening. And it's, I think, less about, there's a part of it which we could call a revival or renewal, or perhaps a pre-revival, whatever language you want to use. But I think there's actually something bigger happening in the culture. And I find that's what's interesting. So I came away going, this almost seems to be something different than how we've understood revivals, renewals, and awakenings in the past.
Sure. So would you say that this could be a spiritual movement emerging from outside the church?
Yeah. It's interesting that, you spoke to people in, traditional churches, Catholic churches, there's people from Orthodox churches where they're not like seeker sensitive. There's churches which I think have, had sort of very missional outward focus, but then this is happening at churches which aren't. But so part of me started to research, is this happening in other areas of the culture? And one of the things that I discovered is that what we're seeing in Europe is not just a sort of turning to faith. And I'd say this is also happening in parts of North America. This is not a turning to Christianity per se. That's happening, but it's part of a broader movement of a turn to the spiritual. But I'd also say the irrational and formally fringe. Teen Vogue, one of my favorite weekly reads, as I was researching, basically, talked about how Gen Z are exploring crystals, tarots, astrology, witchcraft. This is becoming normal, And, you look at the sort of shift. I heard someone describe the shift as, if you look at the history of the History Channel that's on cable TV, if you go back 20 years, the History Channel is very sort of factual, documentation of past events, as you'd expect from a History Channel.
Yes.
But increasingly, you've seen this shift over the last sort of 20 years where it's moved towards ancient aliens and much more into the fringe, And, you think about things like Joe Rogan, who we've spoken about here before. People talk about Joe Rogan and the effect on politics. But less people have spoken about probably more of his corpus, his work is actually focused on sort of paranormal stuff, fringe theories, conspiracy.
Yeah.
And I found this great quote. He said, the world is way weirder than we think. The more I explore, the less I think we know. And I think that's part of what is happening in the broader culture.
So what happens when this spiritual fringe goes mainstream?
Well, what's really interesting, you've had this deep change, I think, happening in the culture towards these things. And, I think the church has always understood that there's fringe things, but I think part of what people need to realize how mainstream this is going, And, there was interesting, I found one article, which was from this year in January, it's like an ad magazine, marketing magazine, Creative Boom, and they basically, it was called The Brands Have Entered the Season of the Witch. And it said this, as the world faces existential crises and the codes of success falter, witchcraft offers more than a nostalgic aesthetic. It's a call to rethink brands, creativity, and connection. As people look more towards the spiritual in times of uncertainty, brands must do the same to prove that they can bridge the gap between the modern secular world and the natural ancient one. Brands need to act as healers, conduits, antidotes, and comforters amidst the fear and overwhelm we feel. And so what you're seeing there is that, even this conversation around paganism is entering into marketing and brand spaces. So previously there'd be like a bit of a secular buffer between these things, like maybe someone on the weekends doing that, but you're not bringing that into your sort of marketing meeting.
Sure.
And I think if you look across the sort of spectrum of culture, the sort of cutting edge of business really has been the tech industry and CEOs and entrepreneurs. And, if you listen to the podcasts, if you read the books, if you follow the social media, these people, increasingly it's becoming normative to use things like ayahuasca and LSD and substances, the spiritual conversation that goes with that. Even Prince Harry, is now talking about his experiences with ayahuasca and psychedelics. So, there's something going on here. And again, too, and I've talked about this before, like you've got the, US Congress has got subcommittees looking at UFOs or UAPs and talking about them not in terms of being aliens, but actually being spiritual, otherworldly sort of beings. But there was one bit which I thought, wow, we've really arrived here. And I showed you guys this clip. I think I sent it to you when it happened. Peter Thiel, who's the massive tech billionaire, hugely connected guy, funded Trump in 2016. One of the first investors in Facebook, who's behind Palantir, part of the PayPal mafia, as they're called. Friends with Elon Musk. He was interviewed by Ross Douthat for the New York Times. And basically, at the end of the interview, it got to something that Thiel's been talking about at places like Stanford and he's been getting out there and talking about it, not in fringe places, in very much the heart of the establishment.
Yes.
He's talking about the Antichrist and how AI could head towards becoming some kind of Antichrist. And there was just this incredible moment in the interview where sort of Ross Douthat is basically saying, hang on, you're saying the Antichrist, he's arguing that it could be like a Greta Thunberg type character, but then, sort of Douthat sort of saying to him, but hang on, you're the one who's got all this huge surveillance tech, you've got this huge control, and talking about, investing in AI and military, and wouldn't that be what possibly someone who was ushering in the Antichrist would be doing, basically saying, doing the things you're doing.
Yeah.
And sort of Thiel stutters and stammers and realizes what's happening. And it just hit me like the New York Times, which is the paper of record, it really is the banner of elite consensus, opinion, is having discussions as to whether a certain person or a certain technology is going to lead to the Antichrist. That's a significant shift.
Huge. So how would you say that this differs from past spiritual resurgences?
Yeah, so again, this isn't a repeat of earlier revivals. I think there's a deeper shift going on. I think about a lot of what my work has been in the last sort of 10, 15 years, it's been helping people to come to grips with the shift towards a post-Christian culture. Probably my book, Disappearing Church, really was my main attempt to capture that. And what it's like where in a post-Christian society, where previously under Christendom paradigm or a more Christian society, you've had some sense of sort of social cachet that disappears. And a post-Christian society is really one where people are disillusioned with the church or disillusioned with Christianity. I think what is happening, one of the big sort of takeaways I returned from Europe with, and this is more, it wasn't just because of Europe, it was a confirmation of what I've been suspecting, is that we're moving from a post-Christian culture to a post-secular culture. So in a post-Christian culture, people are, want to have the fruits. I talked about the kingdom without the king. Yes. The fruits of Christianity. Tom Holland's book Dominion says, all this stuff we don't think is Christian actually is. But in a post-secular society, people are disillusioned with the entire secular framework, or they're disillusioned with the systems of whom's main worldview is secularism.
Yes.
So this is more than this, how do we sort of position ourselves in a negative world? This is actually very new frontier where there's an openness, because that's a very different missional environment, a post-secular environment to the post-Christian environment. But I just want to just tease this out a little bit, because I think this is different in different places.
Okay.
So a lot of the US is still post-Christian. And even there'd be some places which you could argue are still Christian. So in a lot of the US, you've got a move from Christian to post-Christian, or you've got a lot of places which are now pretty solidly post-Christian.
Okay.
But I think what you're seeing in Europe, I think in Australia, you're seeing this in other Western countries as well. You're seeing a rise of a post-secular reality. So a post-secular Europe is someone whose grandparents went to church, their parents raised them not to go to church and despise Christianity or have nothing to do with it, or it's irrelevant. And then all of a sudden one day you go, I don't actually know that much about Christianity. I might check that out. Whereas a post-Christian thing is like, I grew up in the church and I don't like it, or my parents tried to push this on me. So there's distance between you and a viable Christian generation.
Yes.
And that means it's a much more of a blank slate. Now, again, too, as we'll find out, a lot of this is being driven by dissatisfaction. So we'll come back to this, but I just wanted to sort of pass out something I think is a difference between Europe that I noticed and Australia. I think the post-Christian thing, it's also affected by the historical story of those nations. So,
Totally.
in Europe, if you're in a Northern European city and you've got this great Lutheran history going back and churches everywhere, and then you've got a part of town which is heavily Islamic where they're building minarets and mosques, all of a sudden you start, you ask the question, what am I? In a multicultural environment like Australia or New Zealand, where you don't have everyone apart from Indigenous population and migrants, it just plays out differently.
Yes.
And I think also, in Australia, it's not just post-secularism is being driven by dissatisfaction. So I think I'm noticing in Australia, and I've chatted with people in New Zealand about this as well, the dissatisfaction thing here is not as prominent as yet. So you can sort of remain in a sort of like neutral space for longer. Yes. But maybe we'll sort of tease that out. But I just wanted to say that if there's someone sitting here going, I live in this part of the US. What are you talking about? We're still post-Christian, or you may be transitioning to post-Christian.
Yes.
But I still would argue, I think there's parts of the US that are becoming post-secular. I think, even, being in San Francisco, last year, there's elements of the conversations of having felt like some of the conversations in Europe post-secular, where people are sort of like, and there's even a thing too as well where the consensus has been post-Christian, and the elites are post-Christian. So there's a rebelliousness then to go, well, if all of the elites and my teachers and big business and the government are post-Christian in my city, well, maybe the most rebellious thing to do is to convert to orthodoxy. So there's that dynamic going on as well.
Can I just ask, do you think for those people that are actually still live in a what I describe to be a post-Christian culture, in what you're saying, could you almost forecast a little bit for those kind of spaces that actually probably what is next is something that's more post-secular, which kind of leads? Like, is it that linear, do you think? Or is it?
I don't know if it's that linear, and I think it's different. So, for example, in the US, because of polarization, religion, and I think the US just has been an outlier in secularization, that it's just a more religious country. And even irreligious people in America seem religious to us, just in their sort of extroversion or whatever. So, my theory is that very much religion now is tied up in the culture war, and you'll still see politicians, in the US who don't live Christian lives proclaiming Christianity or trying to connect in with a vibe, So like now you've almost sort of got like almost a sort of like right-wing vibe around a return to God and country sort of thing. So that's still I'll call that a strong politically animated cultural Christianity. In Europe, there's a cultural Christianity there, but it's historic.
Yes.
And it may be like in the past, but it's still around because of just the landscape of the place and your national story, your national culture. Where it's interesting in Australia, like we've talked about, some of the recent data coming out of the census and so on. Really, in Australia, cultural Christianity has died. It's like it's just not around. And that's also Australia. Also, is very much it doesn't look back in history. It's sort of a bit traumatized past. Like I think the Indigenous story, the migrants getting away from other parts in the world, the convict story. There's a lot of not wanting to grapple with the past, and so I think that in Australia, it's sort of like here we are now. So again, it's different in different countries, and that'd be true for Canada or parts of Canada. Quebec would be different from British Columbia, or whatever. So I don't think it's linear, but I think what we're seeing in popular culture, in internet culture, in global culture, there is a growing post-secular space.
Yeah.
So again, too, this is the other thing. Like you can say that, again, I just said Quebec. There'd be 100% story of a French-speaking story of secularization and a more French, La Cité story of secularism in Quebec to different parts of Canada. But there's still someone sitting in a cafe listening to Joe Rogan on their iPhone. So this goes across, you got a global thing that's sort of interacting with the local.
Yes.
Sure, yeah.
I'm also interested to know kind of what typifies the dissatisfaction, and maybe you'll answer this a little bit in the next with your answer to the next question. What does post-secularism look like?
Well, I thought part of it is I frame this with an increasing return of not just the spiritual, but what was formerly seen as the irrational. So there's a really interesting article in our ABC, our national broadcaster, and they talked about the growth of belief in two things simultaneously amongst Gen Z. And this has been tracked since 2020. So two things. Gen Z in Australia said very strongly, we believe in science, we believe in empirical science, and we're big on science and data. At the same time, and rationality. At the same time, they also said that their belief in astrology is growing at a rapid rate. So again, to ABC News in Australia found that 48% of Australians believe in ghosts or spiritual entities. Interesting, in the UK, 72% of people engage in everyday superstitions. Now, classically how this has been framed in the past is, well, there was a story of secularization which goes that you had the sort of folk beliefs which were magic, and then we went to the higher form of organised religion, and then we became scientific and got rid of it, and it's this progression. But interesting, in the UK, amongst university students who are the most educated, there's a higher uptake in astrology. So 70% of UK university students say read horoscopes, and 85% say their zodiac sign fits their personality. But this is really interesting. In Canada, so if you look at most Western countries, there tends to be about 1 in 2 believe in ghosts or spiritual entities. But in Canada, there's greater detail in the data, and 46 to 50% believe in supernatural beings, but it's weighted towards Gen Z. So I can't remember, I haven't got the data in front of me. I think it was like 33% of boomers believe in supernatural beings or ghosts or spirits or whatever. Sure. But Gen Z, it's like much higher. It's like 60%. So what you're seeing is not just a more openness to religion, but a more openness to the supernatural realm amongst Gen Z. Now, what's interesting as well is what the ABC found out is that in Australia, and I think this would probably track into other countries with similar phenomenon, is that those stats went up post-2020. So after 2020, and we'll come to this, I think, later, after 2020, something changed. Something has fundamentally changed in the last 5 years around this stuff, but even particularly in the last 2 years. So yeah.
So you mentioned back in the last point about this dissatisfaction that's emerging in Europe and Australia. What would you say that looks like?
Well, look, I think a helpful framework to understand what's going on and what the dissatisfaction, the role it's playing is Paul Hebert was a missiologist. So he was basically a person who studied the science of missions and culture and anthropology and how do you communicate the gospel across, cultural groups. And he had this concept of what he called the excluded middle. Now, what secularism does is it divides the world into two zones, the natural and the supernatural. So the natural is what can be empirically proven by the scientific method. It's where rationality and reason reign. And anything that doesn't fit in there must be thrown into the supernatural. So all of the political answers, all of the personal answers, secularism tells us can be found by just working in the natural. If you're going to believe in religion, if you're going to believe in gods, you do it in your own private time, but it's going to happen. That's part of the supernatural. And we don't take that as a real thing, ultimately. So the world has this clear division. Now, that's not how most of history has operated. But what he talked about was this realm that existed between the two. It's not, you couldn't necessarily call it high religion. You couldn't call it naturalist. It could be a belief that there is luck in the world or fortune. It could be the family who thinks we're different to others because we always have bad luck. One story I've used to illustrate this is that when my boys were young, we're twins, still have twins, and they were little toddlers, and we had double pusher, pram, stroller, whatever you call it, where you are. And we were inside an indoor shopping centre, and it had been raining, and one of them had, I can't remember which son, one of them had an umbrella. And again, too, this is Australia. We're meant to be a secular post-Christian country. And he just had his umbrella open. Now, there's the classic superstitious belief that you shouldn't open an umbrella indoors. So I'm walking this Doncaster, Westfield shopping town, walking inside this long distance, and the amount of people which came up to me and was seriously going, like, he needs to shut that. He needs to shut the umbrella. Like, rational, smart-looking, educated people, he needs to shut that because they were afraid that I would bring bad luck. So what is that? Would you call that religion? I don't think you would. But also this world of ghosts and things which seem, like Hebert said, it's the stuff that's sort of this world, but it doesn't fit neatly into the natural, and it's not so otherworldly you put it in the supernatural. And another way that he talked about, this could be curses, healing, deliverance, spiritual forces, ghosts, fairies, goblins, psychic abilities, astrology, rituals, witchcraft, the idea that fate has almost got a sort of personality, all of that stuff, certain parts of even alternative medicines, alternative, things, some paranormal stuff, crypto, ancient aliens, a lot of this fits into that, right? So one way to think about this is Hebert also talked about control. So the natural world, what secularism told us is this natural world, through the scientific method, we can bring it under our control for our benefit. And the supernatural is the stuff beyond our world, beyond our control, like the forces of karma or, what different gods are up to, or God or whatever. But then sort of the excluded middle was the stuff of this world, but not under our control. So the student whose parents are deeply worrying whether they're going to pass the exam, they realize they've got no control over that. They get their kid to study, but there's this point where at the end of the day, we can't control that kid when he goes in and does his exam, and we can't control what the markers give the student for their mark. So at that point, they realize they get beyond their control. Is it otherworldly? No, it's an exam. So then maybe they in their village go down to the witch doctor, or they go to a psychic, or they do a ritual, or they do something. They give them a rabbit's foot, something which is trying to control things of this world. So, what Hebert talked about was this is very much the world in which Jesus worked in as well. A lot of kingdom activity. When he sends out Hebert talked about, when he sends out the disciples 2 by 2, he commands them to cast out spirits, to heal the sick, So a lot of people come to spirituality or beyond the secular. They're not necessarily wanting beyond this world things. They're wanting an answer to very real problems, and they've come to the end of themselves. So the excluded middle, it's not a rational place. It's an emotional place. It's a place of anxiety, crisis, loss, spiritual need.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, we've talked about, we started a new congregation not too long ago, and we just looked at some data about that area and was like, why are people coming into this neighborhood? What's the cultural places where you can do mission? And I thought it would be a couple stores or restaurants or whatever, and it ended up being 2 psychic readers is the main reason people drive into this neighborhood. That's people who want to talk to a lost loved one. They want to get advice on their love life, or they want their business to succeed, or they're afraid that they've had a curse placed against them. So what I believe is happening is the excluded middle is very personal in that sense, or familial, like our family or our village. It's small scale.
Yes.
I think what's happening is the crisis that we're seeing in the world, the polycrisis, as Adam Tooze called it, the multiple crises, the sense that the political sphere is increasingly out of control, the ability to get ahead, the cost of living crisis. Economics is so global, so complex now, and so volatile. The volatility, I think we spoke about in our last episode, volatility. The volatility is so huge now that it's like the world is going to a macro excluded middle moment. The other thing I think as well is, there's this sense where there's been a massive humiliation of the elites and elite institutions and elite consensus who have been the guardians of official consensus. In London, there's the Natural History Museum, and it's very much built like a cathedral. And if you walk in there, it feels like an open cathedral space. And up the top there, they've got Charles Darwin sort of on this throne. And, the first time I walked in there, I just remember being really hit by the fact that it was church-like, and he was like a sort of idol in there, or a god looking over things. And in many ways, what you saw in Western culture was a replacement of the church with these sort of like scientific, rational methods. And it's not just about science. It's like, we're going to run the economy. This is what's called technocracy, a reign of experts with technical expertise. The economy will be run by us, and we're the smartest people. The health will be run by us. We'll manage wars and international conflicts. But that whole class has been really humiliated, and whether that's legitimate or not, I'm not making that argument, but I'm saying trust in all of those elite institutions is so low. So that means people go, I don't trust them anymore. So the person who then says that the pyramids were power plants or there are ghosts, all of a sudden has more legitimacy because the plausibility structures of the culture are failing. And the last thing I'd say too is, as the world becomes more multicultural, I walk around my neighborhood and, there are now new houses where there's pictures of Ganesha at the front, or different Chinese religious symbols. There's mosques in different areas. As more people come from outside of the secular West, all of a sudden you do find yourself in a much more tangible way in a sort of religious smorgasbord.
Yes.
So to then believe something else doesn't seem as outlandish as it did when 80% were just secular people. So I think all of those forces are driving us into a kind of excluded middle moment. And part of that excluded middle means people go, you know what? I'm really desperate. I've tried psychics. I've tried ayahuasca. I might just give the church a go. I think that's partially what's happening, versus the church has gotten so compelling, so deep in its devotion. There's this awakening moment where just they go out into the streets and start preaching in the fields. That's happening in some places.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think, we've talked about spot fires here, but I think the size of this move statistically is more about something happening in the culture that's happening out there coming towards the church.
Okay, so if this is happening outside of the church and coming towards us, how do we respond?
Yeah, great question. I think that let's call this a post-secular moment that for some people, and I wonder whether this number will grow as the crises increase, is becoming a kind of spiritual awakening. And I'm not saying that's healthy. I just really want to just repeat here. There's some really positive stuff about people coming to church and some great statistics, but there's also equally people getting into stuff which is not healthy and not of God. So there's some kind of secular breakdown, spiritual awakening happening. So how does the church respond to this moment? Well, I think there's a real danger that this moment becomes a flash in the pan. And there's multiple things we could talk about. There's a danger that this moment becomes politicized. There's some dangers there. I won't talk about that. But I just wanted to, there's interesting, one sort of like idea that captured my mind that I think is applicable here. Anton Jaeger, who's a political guy, he's got a book coming out. It's not out yet. It's called Hyperpolitics. And the articles I've read about it, basically his argument is this. He's asking the question, why has politics seemingly taken over everything? Why are we constantly faced with political crisis every second day? You've got this news cycle that's just so fast now, and just constant shock, outrage. It's like politics has just gone to 10 on the bombastic scale. Yet logically, that should then flow into some kind of massive political reaction of mass politics where one of these things then results in tremendous change in the world. So it seems like every day there's a massive story that's going to change the world, and it doesn't necessarily change the world, and then there's another crisis. It has that feeling, and there's this sort of meme online like, nothing ever happens. And he argues that we live in a world which is hugely digitally connected, where sort of outrage and bombastic rhetoric is what cuts through. So we're connected in ways that we weren't in the past. But we also then live in a world which is mediating institutions have really declined.
Yes.
People are far more disconnected. People are highly individualistic. So your potential of creating a sort of grassroots political movement in response to one of these crises or political moments is really low. The metaphor I would use is that it's like cars have starter motors. The starter motor's small, and the starter motor just gets the bigger engine going, and then the engine runs. It's like, what's it like at the moment is we've got this gigantic starter motor, which can just start in a second with this gigantic rush of energy, but the engine is tiny and doesn't kick over and almost is impossible to start.
Yeah.
So I thought about this, and hyperpolitics is shallow and reactive. It's not lasting or embodied. It's just sound and fury. And I just began to think about this, and I thought, well, the real danger is with people starting to turn up to church, and many more could turn up, there's a real danger that without then the church, like could the church be the same? So we've got this big starter motor of interest in the spiritual, people at a moment of dissatisfaction. We're seemingly in a grey zone where a new political order hasn't really kicked off yet. That will happen at some stage. People will feel safe again, and there'll be a new story to occupy them and take their loyalty. We're not there yet. It's rather so conflicted. There's a real danger that what will happen is that the church won't be the sort of strong, thick-tied Christian community where people can come in who are exploring faith and then be discipled in a lifelong journey. My fear is that some of these people will come for a while and then they're back onto ayahuasca or trying something new, and this has to be met with. So like I made the argument that the church. What's happening is it's coming from outside and the church is not being renewed. Often in great revivals history, the church got renewed and then it went out.
Yes.
I think the invitation is for us to match what's going on out there.
Yeah.
Like unless these people come to a port, if these boats that have set out to the sea and left familiar ports of the past story and are looking for a place to land, will they find constructed ports, deep sea ports with piers and welcoming committees and accommodation to disembark and warehouses to put their stuff in? Or will they find a church which is sort of like crying for people to come in when they're actually coming in? We just have to respond differently. So I think just, that there is a sense where what we're looking for is sort of, we've been in a long period, and I think it's part of the post-Christian thing of where we're trying to perform in this way, so we're culturally relevant. That's understandable. It's an understandable missiology in a post-Christian moment. But we're at a moment now where there's a heck of a lot growing around saying, we're not looking for a church that looks like the culture. The culture sucks, and we're looking for a bigger story. And, I think you're looking for people who are not just about attracting people. It's actually now about discipling them. The easy part might now switch to converting people. The harder part is like, that person just came to faith by walking into church. Are you now walking with her 3 years later and her being transformed? And I do think at the midst of this, I think we've mentioned this before, there is a desperate thing that what people are looking for is not a show, and it's also not a sort of like, like you can go either extreme. You have your sort of showy, super contemporary church, or you can have your very sort of stale, traditional church. What people seem to be looking for is churches, and talking to people overseas, people are turning up at churches where they feel the Spirit of God, turning up Pentecostal churches, Spirit-filled churches. They're turning up at churches, Catholic churches where not just any Catholic churches, but churches which seem to have a sense of God's presence in the Eucharist, or Orthodox churches where there's a sense of otherworldly God's presence in the liturgy. So clearly the sort of the gathering point is people genuinely want to meet Jesus.
Yes.
The presence of Jesus. They don't want other stuff around that. They'll put up with other stuff if it's like directing them towards Jesus. So in a sense, this makes things very simple. It is to be a Jesus-centered discipling community who's in this for the long haul, building community, building ties, discipling people, who recognizes the differences with the world and who can articulate that with people and offer them hope, offer them a different story that's being embodied and lived out.
Yes.
Just to add something more, the post-Christian thing has so defined the imagination of a lot of the church. And there's an element where, churches will sort of rack their brains to come up with the right model. That could be like, what's the right missional model that's replicatable enough? Or it could be what's the big contemporary church model that is attractive to people? How do we have the right worship? Whatever. I think what's happening is that there's almost one argument for all this could be that also, I've just given you a sociological argument. There could just be also the real driver in all of this is a sovereign move of God where he's just drawn a lot of people to himself at this point in time. And so it's not so much then trying to find the right code that cracks what it looks like to do church in a post-Christian environment. I also just want to add one thing too, like because of what I said earlier, there's multiple tracks running at this time. There are people who are still in that post-Christian thing where, they might be really annoyed at the church. You could have a conversation with someone who's just like still post-Christian, and then you have 3 conversations with people who are post-secular, and then you have another conversation with someone who was going to church 6 months ago and has stopped going but needs to come back. The next period, this grey zone moment, will be multiple of these tracks emerging. So the post-secular thing is not going to be like on Tuesday the post-Christians are going to go. There's still stacks of them out there. We're still in process here. And you could be in a context, say in the south of the US where you're like, oh no, we're still going from Christian to post-Christian. But there's still going to be people who could be, as I said, listening to that Joe Rogan podcast or looking at something online who are fully post-secular. So I think we need, just as, you can see Paul adapting, preaching to the Jews, preaching to the Gentiles, preaching the Areopagus to, Greek philosophers. We need to be like Paul in that. We need to realize that there's going to be different groups. I think that's happening. But I just want to make the big thing that I do think there will be a transition towards the post-secular as a growing trend. I think it's the direction that we're moving in.
So I just want to note as well, this is some of the stuff you've been preaching into recently here at Red, and just the different stories that we're hearing from people within our church.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like as you start naming this and starting to talk about it, people are like, oh yeah, I've been having these conversations with people at work.
Yes.
My brother's now asking some questions where he wasn't 10 years ago. So there's lived realities to this in the very real stuff of life.
And even lots of conversations after the sermon's really fascinating. And even people who are like, oh, I'm in this, we're here in Melbourne, super post-Christian, and I just presumed everyone was, didn't believe anything. But then my boss believes in ghosts and that woman's doing tarot and that even that sort of stuff. And then almost almost the thing of actually what I believe just going to church isn't as out there as what they feel that they believe if they shared it.
Yes.
So I think we've presumed, and again too, there's that contrast. I just go back to the ABC News article saying a bunch of Aussies going, we're really scientific, but then they're consulting their astrology. So you could have a conversation with someone who's like, oh, I believe in science and I don't believe that stuff, but I just also saw a ghost. So even there's a post-secular, post-Christian thing within people as well, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Well, fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Mark, for unpacking this for us. We look forward to hearing maybe what you're experiencing in your contexts. And if you want a list of the references or resources that we mentioned during this episode, you can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co and subscribing there. We send out an email a few days after each episode with all of those details and a little video from us. So we'll see you next time.